Firstly, I really want to sort of echo the words of congratulations of 100 years of Rotary in Australia. I won't even start to talk about the achievements that you guys have made over that time, but it's a real honour and privilege to be associated with the organisation in any way. So many thanks. What I wanted to speak about with people was really some of the things that Dr. Ramos-Horta has already touched on in talking about multilateral interventions and things like that, but really take it down to a slightly more worker bee level, if you like, and just to give people some insights as to how that actually looks on the ground, what it is that we do, and a few ideas, I think, of what I've learned, and certainly some of the things that I think we can do better and that we have to do better. So I wanted to touch on two areas. Firstly, some of my experience with NATO in Afghanistan, and then I want to talk a little bit about Somalia and the work that I'm doing at the moment. As Murray said in the introduction, I've had a little bit of experience now in my life to be working in conflict environments, in peace building, but I didn't come to that from a very straight line. My background has been quite diverse and started with a very extensive period farming. And to be honest, I think that's one of my greatest strengths, is that I haven't always been doing this work. I haven't grown up in a system that sees one way of doing it. And one of the things that I can probably bring is I do ask questions. I do continue to ask, why are we doing it this way? How is this leading to the objectives that we have? And that's something that I think anyone involved in this work can really offer, is don't accept the status quo. The world is not in peace. What we have as our standard practice hasn't found all of the solutions yet, so we have to keep looking. What I wanted to sort of start on with Afghanistan is my role there with NATO was as the political director and deputy to the senior civilian representative. So a civilian very much sitting in the middle of a very military environment and a very active conflict. And I want to talk about a couple of things that I did with the external partners from a NATO perspective, so with the Afghan government, and then a little bit of what I learned working inside the organisation. The first piece is that I worked very closely with the National Security Advisor and his team in articulating the Afghan security policy. Now that is something that I think internationals had come and sat with the Afghans many times and tended to send incredibly bright young military officers who felt that their job was to write the security policy and present it to the Afghans. We took a different approach and really spent about 10 months working together to identify what the threats were, to use the language and the perceptions and the way that Afghans were really looking at issues. And then also spend some time translating that in a way that it would be really understandable to the international partners. So make sure that the priorities and the interpretation was there from the local perspective. That probably hadn't been done as well beforehand. And then at the same time, make sure it was sellable. So that was really a fascinating process to move from an opening statement where people wanted to talk about their need for jets and tanks to really being able to talk about the subtle nuances of a major insurgency, Islamic terrorist movements, regional dynamics, what those threats were and how that nation would go about fighting them in a very sort of kinetic military way, how they would go about looking for their international partners, positioning their alliances. And that kind of brought me to the second piece of work that I did, and that was to lead the negotiations for the Afghan-NATO enduring partnership. So that was one of those major building blocks that the Afghan government wanted to put in place to ensure their security. And really the things that I wanted to say about that work centers around really what we as international partners coming in to support a country need to do is to listen and to understand. Our baseline is, for me, and this kind of sounds a little bit geeky, of the country, you don't know where such relationships come from. You'll tend to probably not be able to provide the sort of counsel that is helpful. And you need to be, whether you're looking at it from a very classically military perspective, whether you're looking at coming into a country with a more development, peace-building hat, you need to understand such a breadth of lenses. How does the country work culturally? How do people interact? What is the way that the political movement works? Is it something that you see in a very classic structure, hierarchical, formal structure? Is it outside of that? What's the economic base? How do all of the different power strands in the country interact? And that baseline means you can start to come in and offer useful and helpful advice. And it was one of those sort of early experiences in my life. I was in Afghanistan doing that work in 2010. NATO, for example, had 150,000 international troops in the country, and we had 350,000 Afghan national security forces that we were operating with. So it was a dynamic environment. It was something that we were trying to do good and positive work. The discussion of what we got right and what we got wrong is a much bigger one, and one that I think is happening a lot at the moment, given the American and NATO recent announcements of their withdrawal. But when you are in that environment and able to work with people, able to take that humble learning approach to support the outcomes of a country, it's a really rewarding piece of work to do. And it's one, as I say, I think it's a huge responsibility to have done the homework to be able to do it. I think Dr. Ramos-Horta already said, without knowledge, we're not going to be useful at this work in the way that we should. And that experience in working inside and with really marked my thinking in the last decade. The other piece, which really I think relates, was some work that I did inside of the organization. As the political director, it certainly came across my desk when there were active operations going on. There was a proposed targeted operation in the north of the country, in an area where I was quite concerned that we didn't understand the ramifications of such an operation. It went ahead. It went ahead in an environment where there was a very distinct peak in anti-international feeling that was being driven by Quran burnings in rural America. It went ahead in, as I say, an environment where we didn't have a good visibility as to, if this leader is removed, who is going to come in and take their place. What it did have, and I think what we often get right, is technically all of the international humanitarian and laws of war were followed. Proportionality was in place. The high level of work that was done by the intelligence folk to triangulate that this was a legitimate target was all there. What wasn't there was the contextual, so what happens after we do this? And after that operation took place, it was very much part of triggering big protests in the major city in Mazar-Sharif. Those protests were manipulated and further escalated and resulted in an attack on the UN headquarters. Several staff were beheaded. There was a major withdrawal of the international presence and the humanitarian and development work that they were doing. As a result of that, the very military side of the house brought me in as an advisor to really try and bring some of this more contextual stuff to the technical understanding that was going on. So again, just really highlighting technical military expertise will take you so far, technical political expertise will take you so far, but it's really bringing all of these lenses together that can make us effective and helpful. Moving to Somalia, where I am now. As Murray said, I'm the coordinator with the panel of experts on Somalia. Now that's a group that works directly for the Security Council and is engaged in investigating and providing information to the Council around UN sanctions. Now, UN sanctions are quite a niche area, and I promise that I'm not going to be too obscure in talking to you about that. But just to give some of the basics that a sanctions program such as ours would cover, there's the very classic arms embargo. So it's to try to control the movement of weapons, ammunition, and other military equipment into the country. There's an IED component ban, again, to try and manage and have visibility of what kind of equipment might be available, chemical precursors, fertilizers, those sorts of things, to become available to various terrorist or insurgent groups. We look at natural resources bans for exporting so that we can support the country in not having their natural resource base exploited. We do an awful lot of work on counterterrorism, and so that's, in this case, it's particularly targeted at Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group there. And we have the very broad overview of dealing with any issue that affects the peace, security, and stability of Somalia and the region. So that's kind of what we're there to look at. And to give that a little bit of context, I think even in Australia with pandemics and everything else that's going on, people will have been hearing about Tigray in northern Ethiopia and the increased violence that's been happening there, that conflict has spilled over into the borderlands with Sudan, that Eritrea has been involved, that we have a totally stalled election process in Somalia itself. So the government should have been changed by the 8th of February this year, and that hasn't happened. There is a dispute happening between Kenya and Somalia. There's some 100,000 square kilometers of the Indian Ocean that's being contested with massive resource base happening there. Al-Shabaab is very active. We have Daesh in the country and in the region, particularly exploding in Mozambique at the moment. On a more humanitarian basis, there was the largest locust plague in 75 years has just taken place. We have a continuous cycle environmentally, looking at droughts and floods. And like the rest of the world, Somalia, with an incredibly fragile health system, is trying to deal with COVID. So all of this is happening and has really been something of a status quo for the last 18 months that I've been involved in the country. What I came in to do was really primarily to revive a relationship between this part of the UN and the Somali government, and then to try and build some concrete outcomes. And so this is where I want to really talk about some of the relationship piece, and again, go back and talk a little bit about how do we, on the ground, really come in and support things. So when I arrived in Somalia, there was unfortunately a real problem between the panel and the Somali government. The panel had not been allowed in the country for nearly 2 years. All communication had been cut off. I knew that going in. What I discovered as I arrived is that the challenges weren't just with the Somalis. It was relationships were much more broadly damaged with the rest of the UN, with the neighbouring governments such as Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, major partners like the Turkey, Qatar, UAE. And really, why had this happened? It had happened because although we had some incredibly talented technical experts, those technical experts had forgotten to look up from their siloed work to really understand what was it that we were trying to change in Somalia? What was it that we were trying to bring to build? Sanctions are often measured by three criteria: coerce, constrain, and signal. And they're things that have generally got a negative connotation. If you go back and think about the issues that I said we were there to look at, there's a real component there that is about building weapons and ammunition management systems, about building state building capacities for the Somalis to be able to control all sorts of parts of their system, about building and understanding and being able to articulate really clearly what the threat of groups like Al-Shabaab are. And by being able to understand those groups in such a way as to know where there is the potential for defections, for reconciliation, how do we really go about degrading those negative forces in a non-military manner? And some of the things that we do in that is understanding the financial control of such a group, really looking at using designations and listings. And really, none of that positive work can happen unless we have the relationships in place. It took some months, but I now work every day closely inside the Somali government. We have very tough conversations about some of the big challenging issues, but we have them because they can see that this part of the UN, this tool of the UN, is trying to build something that is positive. We've built relationships with the neighbouring countries because we've helped articulate the challenges that they face with Al-Shabaab and Daesh on a regional basis. None of these sorts of groups operate distinctly and neatly inside a country. International boundaries are not particularly important to them. So how do we bring those partners together? And the difference, as I say, is from 2 years of no formal communication and no access to the country to being able to easily access the country, COVID allowing. And as I say again, really having these difficult conversations. What is the challenge for government from a group like Shabaab, who can control populations, can control information, and can tax a population without having physical control of territory? Those are not easy topics for a government to confront because they expose weaknesses. But if we don't confront them, I think we're not in a position to help build a response to that. So again, it's really trying to understand all of the interconnectedness of these challenges, the different lenses that we need to analyze and understand the country through, and then working on the relationship part. And that has to come from understanding the perspectives of those people dealing with the challenges, those people whose communities, whose families are suffering from conflict. It can never come from an arrogant view of what to do. But I think there is a real prospect for positive input from the multilateral organizations. And that's something that I am very keen to continue to do. I think we always have to remind ourselves in the middle of busy days to look up and what is the piece that I'm working on today. Am I ticking a box that New York needs me to tick, or am I doing something that is going to add to the situation in Somalia? And we need to be reminded of that. The UN needs to be reminded of that. And the constituents of the UN are you. So we answer to you, and you need to demand of us that we do this kind of work, and we do it in the most dynamic, agile, and professional way that we can. Again, thank you so much for listening. Apologies for my camera. I was looking forward to at least being able to see you a little bit. But Murray, thank you very much.